Tonight, we're uncovering the remarkable story of Japan during World War I, a rising empire that seized a global opportunity to expand its influence, reshape Asia, and claim a seat among the world's great powers. From distant naval patrols to bold territorial demands, Japan's role in the First World War is often overlooked, yet it played a key part in setting the stage for a century of change across the Pacific. So, before we all get nice and comfortable, take a moment, if you haven't already, to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let us know the time and location from which you're watching. Now let's step into this fascinating moment in history, and we hope it helps you learn while you sleep. In the early 20th century, Japan was a nation in transformation, ancient in heritage, yet rapidly modernizing. By 1914, the Empire of Japan had already stunned the world with its victory over the Russian Empire in 1905. It was the first time an Asian power had defeated a major European nation in modern warfare. That triumph, cemented by the Treaty of Portsmouth, catapulted Japan onto the world stage as a formidable naval and imperial force. But when Europe erupted into war in July 1914, few expected Japan, geographically distant, and still viewed through a lens of Western skepticism, to play a role. And yet, within weeks of the conflict's outbreak, Japan made a strategic move that would define its international ambitions for the next half-century. Japan's entry into World War I was not driven by the same forces that had plunged Europe into chaos. There was no entangled web of alliances pulling it in, no ethnic grievances or assassinated archdukes. Instead, Japan acted out of opportunity. It saw in the war a chance to expand its naval influence, seize German colonial possessions in East Asia, and further assert its power as the dominant force in the Pacific. And it had the legal pretext to act. Back in 1902, Japan had signed the Anglo-Japanese Alliance, a military agreement that stated Japan would come to Britain's aid in the event of war in East Asia. With Germany holding colonial territories in the Pacific, and with its prized naval base in China at Qingdao, Japan seized the opportunity. On August 15, 1914, Japan delivered an ultimatum to Germany: withdraw your naval vessels from Asian waters and cede control of Jiaozhou Bay in Shandong province. Germany refused. On August 23, 1914, Japan formally declared war on Germany. In doing so, it became the first non-European power to enter the First World War, not as a minor participant, but as a rising empire with ambitions that would soon stretch across oceans. Mobilization was swift. The Imperial Japanese Navy, one of the most modern in Asia, was ready. Troop transports began moving men and material to the Chinese coast. The Japanese began preparing for their first major campaign of the war, the Siege of Qingdao. This operation would mark a critical turning point, both in Japan's international reputation and in its strategic vision. At home, the decision to go to war was met with a mix of patriotic fervor and pragmatic calculation. The Japanese government saw the conflict not only as a way to support its British ally but as a chance to expand its influence in China and the Pacific, under the guise of supporting international order. But even as war drums sounded, there were voices of concern within Japan. Some worried about provoking conflict with China, others feared that entering a European war would entangle the empire in distant, unpredictable affairs. Yet the imperial leadership, particularly Foreign Minister Kato Takaki, saw the long game. If Japan could claim Germany's colonies, it could redraw the map of Asia. Across the Pacific, Western powers watched with mixed reactions. Britain welcomed Japanese support, especially the protection of Allied shipping routes. But other colonial powers, particularly the United States and Australia, watched uneasily as Japan began to assert dominance in the Pacific. The war had begun as a European affair. But with Japan's entry, the map widened. And as its ships sailed toward Qingdao, and its soldiers marched into foreign territory, Japan signaled that it would no longer be a silent observer in the great global conflicts of the 20th century. It was now a player, bold, calculating, and ready to rise. By the early autumn of 1914, as the battle lines in Europe were hardening into trenches, Japan prepared for its first major military campaign of the war, the Siege of Qingdao. Qingdao, or Tsingtao, as it was known under German rule, was no ordinary outpost. It was the crown jewel of Germany's colonial empire in East Asia, a bustling port on the Shandong Peninsula in northeastern China. With a modern harbor, railways, fortified defenses, and a prized naval base, Qingdao had been transformed into a symbol of German imperial pride. But now, it had become a target. On September 2, 1914, Japanese warships established a naval blockade of Jiaozhou Bay, cutting off the German-controlled territory from sea resupply. A few days later, Japanese troops, joined by a small British contingent, began landing on the nearby coast. Their objective was clear: encircle the German garrison and capture the city. The Japanese force was large and well organized, over 23,000 soldiers, supported by heavy artillery, naval guns, and air reconnaissance. In contrast, the German defenders numbered only about 4,500, consisting of a mix of naval personnel, colonial troops, and civilian volunteers. Outnumbered and isolated, they prepared for a desperate stand. The siege would last over 2 months, a grueling campaign fought in rugged terrain, under the looming threat of disease and supply shortages. The Japanese began digging trenches toward the German fortifications, advancing methodically. They brought with them heavy artillery, including massive howitzers capable of breaching reinforced bunkers. From the sea, warships shelled coastal positions. For the first time in modern warfare, the Japanese also used aircraft to scout enemy lines and drop bombs, a glimpse of the future. Despite the overwhelming force against them, the German defenders fought with determination. They launched night raids, counterattacks, and sniper ambushes. The fortress at Qingdao was heavily fortified, protected by barbed wire, deep trenches, and concrete bunkers. It would not fall easily. But the balance of power was clear. As October gave way to November, Japanese artillery fire intensified. The air raids grew more accurate. The trench lines crept closer. On November 6, 1914, after a sustained bombardment, Japanese forces launched their final assault. They breached the German outer defenses and began advancing toward the heart of the settlement. By dawn on November 7, the German governor, Meyer Waldeck, surrendered. The siege of Qingdao was over. The Japanese had won a decisive victory, and it was more than just military. The fall of Qingdao marked the first significant Allied victory of the First World War. It was a symbolic blow to German prestige and a clear message: Japan had arrived as a modern military power, capable of projecting force far from its shores. The aftermath, however, was complex. While the Japanese were welcomed by many Allied leaders, the Chinese government protested bitterly. Qingdao was Chinese territory, leased to Germany, not owned, and now it had been seized by another foreign power. What had begun as a campaign against Germany quickly transformed into a deeper political entanglement. Nevertheless, back in Japan, the victory was met with national pride. Newspapers celebrated the bravery of the soldiers. Parades honored returning officers. Qingdao was not just a battlefield win, it was a moment of validation for the empire's ambitions. But this was only the beginning. With Qingdao under Japanese control, attention turned south, to Germany's Pacific possessions. The islands of Micronesia, the Marshalls, the Carolines, remote, scattered, but strategically vital. The rising sun was ready to shine further across the Pacific. And in doing so, Japan would reshape not only the war in Asia, but the map of the entire Pacific Rim. With the fall of Qingdao in November 1914, Japan had already achieved a symbolic and strategic victory. But the empire's ambitions extended far beyond the Chinese mainland. As European powers fought bitterly in the trenches of the Western Front, Japan turned its gaze across the Pacific, toward the scattered archipelagos of Micronesia, the Carolines, the Marshalls, and the Marianas. These islands, dotted across the central and western Pacific Ocean, had belonged to Imperial Germany since the late 19th century. Though remote and lightly garrisoned, they were of enormous naval and geopolitical value. Whoever controlled them could project power across shipping lanes and safeguard maritime trade routes from Asia to the Americas. To Japan, they represented both an opportunity and a test. the chance to expand its reach across the Pacific, and to assert itself as the dominant Asian naval power, all under the banner of supporting the Allied war effort. Unlike the drawn-out campaign in Qingdao, the seizure of these islands was swift and largely unopposed. In October 1914, even as the siege in China was ongoing, Japanese naval squadrons moved southward. The Imperial Japanese Navy dispatched fleets to the Marshall Islands, the Caroline Islands, and the Mariana Islands. These territories were defended only by small German colonial detachments, a few soldiers, officials, and settlers. One by one, the islands fell without a fight. The German colonial presence was simply too weak and too isolated to resist. Japanese cruisers raised the imperial flag over Truk, Ponape, Yap, and Saipan. No large battles took place, and minimal blood was shed. But these were not symbolic gestures. These were deliberate, strategic occupations. To the Japanese High Command, the islands offered more than prestige. They offered a military buffer zone, a southern defense line, and, importantly, a foundation for future expansion. Ports were mapped, harbors fortified, and telegraph cables examined. Airfields would come later, in another war, but the groundwork was already being laid. At home, the government in Tokyo celebrated these acquisitions as further proof of Japan's rightful place among the global powers. Newspapers printed maps of the expanding empire. Editorials praised the wisdom of seizing territory, abandoned by Europe. But not everyone looked on approvingly. The United States, which had long viewed the Pacific as its strategic backyard, was alarmed. Though Japan and the U.S. were not enemies in 1914, there was an undercurrent of rivalry. American officials began quietly monitoring Japan's moves in Micronesia, particularly near Guam and the Philippines. Australia, too, was wary. Though allied with Britain and Japan, Australia had its own ambitions in the Pacific and resented Japanese control so close to its northern frontier. To appease its allies, Japan emphasized its temporary role in administering these islands, insisting they would be returned or managed under international authority after the war. But behind the scenes, Japanese leaders had no intention of giving them up. These islands were now part of the empire. Quietly, methodically, Japan began incorporating them into its naval defense network. The success of these occupations, swift, efficient, and bloodless, boosted confidence in Tokyo. It proved that Japan could expand without prolonged warfare, that it could act on par with Western powers, and that its navy, modernized and well-coordinated, was a force to be reckoned with across a much broader region than previously imagined. As Europe drowned in mud and machine guns, Japan was building its legacy differently, through calculated strikes, expanding borders, and quiet consolidation. It had seized Germany's East Asian holdings. Now it held a belt of islands stretching thousands of miles across the Pacific. Japan had entered the war to make a statement. Now the world was beginning to listen. By the time the guns fell silent on November 11, 1918, Japan stood among the victors of the First World War. It had achieved its war aims: the capture of Qingdao, the occupation of Germany's Pacific territories, and a strengthened naval presence across East Asia. But as soldiers returned home and Europe turned toward reconstruction, Japan's next battle would not be fought with ships or rifles. It would be waged in the corridors of diplomacy. In 1919, delegates from more than 30 nations gathered in Paris to redraw the world map and define the new global order. Japan, represented by an experienced delegation led by Marquis Saionji Kinmochi, arrived at the Paris Peace Conference as one of the Big Five powers, alongside Britain, France, the United States, and Italy. It was a moment of prestige. Never before had a non-European nation sat as an equal among the world's great empires. But beneath the surface of formality and handshakes, tensions simmered, not only between rival powers but between old prejudices and new realities. Japan came to Paris with clear goals. First, it wanted formal recognition of its territorial gains, the German Pacific Islands north of the equator, and Qingdao, which it had occupied since 1914. Second, it sought a permanent seat in the League of Nations, the new international body being formed to prevent future wars. But Japan also brought something else, something revolutionary. It proposed a clause to be added to the League Covenant, a statement of racial equality. The racial equality proposal, as it came to be known, was a bold move. It stated that all nations, regardless of race or nationality, should be treated equally, a principle that seemed in line with the League's ideals of justice and peace. For Japan, the clause was more than symbolic. It was a response to years of Western discrimination, exclusion from immigration policies, unequal treatment of diplomats, and the dismissive attitudes of European colonial powers. Japan wanted recognition not just as a victor, but as a civilized, equal power on the world stage. Initially, the clause gained support. A majority of delegates approved the language, and some saw it as a natural evolution of the League's mission. But behind closed doors, opposition grew, especially from the British Empire and the United States. Australia, part of the British delegation, feared the clause would undermine its White Australia policy, which restricted non-European immigration. The US, though not yet officially rejecting it, shared concerns that it might affect its own exclusionary laws. In a pivotal moment, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson, acting as chairman, declared that unanimous consent was required for such a proposal, a requirement not applied to other clauses. Despite a majority in favor, the racial equality proposal was shelved. Japan's delegates were stunned. They had played by the rules, supported the Allies, and fought in good faith. Now, they were being denied a basic principle they believed the West claimed to uphold. Though Japan did secure its territorial claims, receiving a mandate over the German islands and Qingdao, the rejection of racial equality left a bitter mark. Back in Tokyo, the outcome was received with mixed feelings: pride in territorial gains, frustration at diplomatic hypocrisy, and a growing sense that Japan would never be truly accepted by the West. The Paris Peace Conference had shown the limits of victory. It had revealed a world still shaped by old empires and older prejudices. And it had planted the seeds of doubt in Japan's future, about whether cooperation, diplomacy, and Western ideals could truly offer equality. The war had elevated Japan, but the peace would begin to redefine its path. While Europe's attention remained fixed on the horrors of trench warfare, Japan had already begun working behind the scenes to expand its influence in East Asia. For the Japanese government, World War I was more than a military conflict. It was an opening to secure long-term dominance on the continent. And at the heart of this ambition lay a bold and controversial move: the 21 Demands. By early 1915, Japan had established control over Qingdao and much of the former German sphere in Shandong province, as well as German territories in the Pacific. But these victories were just the beginning. Japan sought to use its wartime leverage to extract concessions from a weakened China, which was then fractured by internal strife, warlordism, and a fragile central government under President Yuan Shikai. On January 18, 1915, Japan presented its 21 demands to the Chinese government, a sweeping list of conditions that, if accepted, would dramatically expand Japan's political and economic reach throughout China. The demands were divided into 5 groups. The first group confirmed Japan's claims to Shandong, demanding that China recognize its control over former German concessions. The second group called for further Japanese rights in South Manchuria and eastern Inner Mongolia, including extended leases and expanded economic privileges. The third group asked for joint control over mining operations in central China. The fourth group restricted China from giving any coastal or island concessions to other foreign powers, effectively a move to prevent further Western intrusion. But it was the fifth group that caused the greatest uproar. These secret provisions included demands for Japan to be granted control over Chinese police, arms purchases, and political advisors, changes that would have effectively reduced China to a Japanese protectorate. The demands were met with immediate resistance, not only from Chinese nationalists but also from Western powers, particularly Britain and the United States, who saw Japan's overreach as a threat to the balance of power in Asia. China tried to stall. Protests erupted across Chinese cities, uniting students, merchants, and political leaders against what they called national humiliation. Newspapers published open letters, and demonstrations spread. It was one of the first major displays of modern Chinese nationalism, sparked directly by Japanese imperial ambition. Under international pressure and domestic outrage, Japan eventually withdrew the fifth group of demands. On May 25, 1915, China signed a treaty agreeing to most of the first four groups. Though diluted from their original form, the 21 demands still significantly expanded Japan's influence in China. But the political damage was done. Across China, Japan was now seen not as a liberator or a fellow Asian power resisting the West, but as a new imperial aggressor. The incident poisoned Sino-Japanese relations for years to come and sowed deep mistrust that would later explode into conflict. Even within Japan, the outcome sparked debate. While the government framed it as a diplomatic victory, many intellectuals and moderates criticized the move, warning that aggression would isolate Japan and undermine its standing among the great powers. Internationally, Japan's image also began to shift. Its early role as an ally in the war had earned praise, but now the 21 demands painted a different picture, one of territorial ambition, economic coercion, and quiet imperialism. It was clear that Japan's vision of Asia clashed with that of the West, and with China's own growing nationalism. The demands had been partially accepted, but the consequences would echo for decades. They revealed Japan's desire not merely to be equal to Western powers, but to replace them in Asia. And in doing so, Japan began walking a path, not toward partnership, but toward domination. While Japan expanded its reach on land during World War I, from Shandong to the scattered islands of Micronesia, it was at sea where the empire truly established its reputation as a rising global force. From the outset of the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy played a significant but often overlooked role in the Allied effort. Bound by its 1902 alliance with Great Britain, Japan was obligated to protect Allied interests in East Asia and the Pacific. But Tokyo saw the war as an opportunity not just to fulfill treaty obligations, but to showcase its technological advancement, its strategic vision, and its ability to act as guardian of the Pacific. One of Japan's first missions after declaring war on Germany in 1914 was to eliminate the threat of the German East Asia Squadron, a powerful naval group commanded by Admiral Maximilian von Spee. Though the final destruction of Spee's squadron occurred at the hands of the British off the Falkland Islands, Japanese naval patrols were instrumental in disrupting German communications and movements throughout the Pacific. But Japan's naval contributions went far beyond Asia. In 1917, as the war expanded and Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, Japan sent warships all the way to the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea to support Allied convoys. The 2nd Special Squadron, composed of cruisers and destroyers, operated from bases in Malta and Singapore, escorting hundreds of merchant ships and troop transports, many carrying British and French soldiers to distant theaters of war. Japanese naval officers, disciplined and professional, earned the respect of their European counterparts. Their presence was especially crucial in protecting vital supply routes from German U-boats, which had become a deadly menace to Allied logistics. In total, Japan's naval forces escorted more than 700 ships during the war, losing only one destroyer, the Sakaki, to enemy action. Its quiet effectiveness gained it recognition from Britain, France, and even grudging respect from the United States. Yet behind the surface of cooperation, rivalry was growing. The U.S. had emerged as a global naval power in its own right, with strong interests in the Pacific, especially the Philippines, Guam, and Hawaii. American officials watched Japan's steady acquisition of former German islands with unease. Though allies in war, the two nations were already beginning to strategically compete. Meanwhile, Japan's growing influence in the Pacific, particularly over the South Seas Mandate, gave it de facto control over a swath of ocean stretching from the Ryukyu Islands to the Marshall Islands. These positions would later prove crucial in World War II, but their foundations were laid during this time of cooperation cloaked in caution. Naval expansion at home also accelerated. The Japanese government increased funding for dreadnought-class battleships, improved its shipbuilding industry, and modernized naval strategy through studies of British and German doctrine. Officers were trained abroad and at home with growing confidence. The goal was clear: Japan wanted not just parity with the West, it wanted naval dominance in the Asia-Pacific region. Despite its contributions, Japan was never fully embraced by its Western allies. Cultural bias, colonial anxiety, and racial prejudice still colored interactions, particularly with Australia and the United States. Japan was praised as a useful ally, but not yet trusted as an equal partner. Still, the Navy's performance spoke for itself. It had patrolled half the globe, protected Allied supply chains, and enforced Japanese claims across an expanding maritime empire. By the end of the war, Japan no longer merely occupied space on the map. It controlled key maritime routes and held strategic islands that would shape global conflict in the decades ahead. The rising sun had not yet peaked, but its reflection now glimmered on the waves of every ocean it touched. While Japan's territorial and naval expansions during World War I shaped its global image, the war's most profound impacts were felt at home. The conflict in Europe, far from weakening Japan, triggered a surge of economic growth, industrial development, and subtle but significant political shifts that would lay the foundation for the modern Japanese state. By 1914, Japan had already begun industrializing, following the ambitious modernization campaigns of the Meiji era. But the war accelerated this transformation on an unprecedented scale. As European powers redirected their industrial capacities toward the war effort, they left behind vast gaps in global trade. Japan stepped in to fill the void. Between 1914 and 1918, Japan's exports more than tripled, fueled by rising demand for textiles, steel, ships, and machinery. Japanese manufacturers supplied goods not just to Asian markets, but increasingly to Allied powers desperate for material support. Silk, in particular, became a prized commodity, making Japan the world's leading silk exporter by the end of the war. This economic boom created a new generation of industrialists and entrepreneurs, many of whom became powerful political voices. The wealth generated during the war years transformed cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Yokohama, bringing new infrastructure, electric railways, and consumer culture to a society that had been largely agrarian just decades earlier. The Zaibatsu, large industrial conglomerates like Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, and Mitsui, grew stronger, expanding their control over shipping, banking, mining, and foreign trade. These corporations not only influenced the economy, but began to shape foreign policy, encouraging Japan's pursuit of overseas markets and raw materials. But rapid growth came with growing pains. Inflation soared. The price of rice, a staple food, skyrocketed, triggering the rice riots of 1918, which swept across the country. For weeks, protesters, many of them poor farmers, fishermen, and urban workers, clashed with police, looted warehouses, and demanded economic reforms. The government, caught off guard, responded with force, arresting thousands and cracking down on dissent. But the unrest revealed a deeper truth. While Japan's industrial elite had benefited immensely from the war, ordinary citizens were struggling with inequality, food shortages, and political marginalization. These tensions fed into a broader transformation of Japanese politics. In 1918, amid the turmoil of the rice riots and rising calls for reform, Japan appointed its first commoner prime minister, Hara Takashi, leader of the Saiyukai party. Unlike his aristocratic predecessors, Hara was a civilian politician who championed constitutional government and party politics, a shift away from the oligarchic control of the old Meiji elite. Under Hara, Japan saw increased investment in education, infrastructure, and civil administration. His tenure symbolized a step toward parliamentary democracy, albeit one still constrained by the influence of the emperor, the military, and business conglomerates. The press grew more independent. Political parties gained traction. And the idea that Japan could be both imperial and democratic began to take root, a duality that would define the contradictions of the 20th century Japanese state. Meanwhile, Japan's youth, increasingly urban, literate, and exposed to Western ideas, demanded more. New literary movements, socialist circles, and feminist voices emerged in Tokyo cafes and university halls. Though still small in number, these movements reflected the stirrings of modern civil society. World War I had changed Japan's position on the global stage. But it also reshaped Japan itself, pushing it further along the path of industrialization, expanding its political institutions, and setting the stage for future tensions between military ambition and democratic ideals. In the factories, in the diet, and in the streets, a new Japan was emerging, energetic, complex, and ready to challenge the old order both at home and abroad. In 1919, as the smoke of World War I cleared and diplomats gathered at the Palace of Versailles, Japan arrived with confidence. It had been on the winning side. Its military campaigns had been successful. Its navy had patrolled oceans thousands of miles from home. And now, Japan expected to be rewarded, not just with territory, but with recognition as a global equal. But Versailles would prove to be a turning point, not only for Japan, but for its relationship with the rest of Asia. At the heart of the diplomatic battle was Shandong province in China. Japan had seized Qingdao and the surrounding region from Germany early in the war. Now, it demanded formal recognition of its claims to all of Germany's former rights in Shandong: railways, mining rights, and territorial concessions. China, which had also joined the Allies in the final year of the war, expected that those territories would be returned to Chinese control. Chinese diplomats, led by statesman Wellington Koo, passionately argued that Japan's occupation had been temporary, a wartime measure, not a legitimate transfer of sovereignty. China's expectations were rooted in President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, particularly the promise of self-determination for colonized peoples. Chinese students, intellectuals, and reformers believed that Wilson's liberal ideals would finally break the grip of imperialism on their homeland. But reality proved otherwise. Despite public posturing, the major Allied powers, Britain, France, and even Wilson's United States, sided with Japan. They feared alienating a key Pacific ally and were eager to maintain the fragile unity that had emerged during the war. Japan had negotiated secret agreements with Britain and France during the conflict, promising it German rights in Shandong. These deals were honored. And so, in the final Treaty of Versailles, Japan was awarded all former German privileges in Shandong. The decision sparked outrage across China. On May 4, 1919, thousands of students gathered in Beijing's Tiananmen Square, waving banners and shouting slogans. Their protests quickly spread to other cities: Shanghai, Wuhan, Guangzhou, uniting students, workers, merchants, and even some politicians in a nationwide outcry. This became the May 4th movement, a turning point in modern Chinese history. At its core, the protests were more than just anti-Japanese. They were a rejection of Western betrayal, a denouncement of China's weak government, and a rallying cry for modernization, science, democracy, and national renewal. The movement gave rise to new political ideologies, including Chinese nationalism, Marxism, and anti-imperialism, that would shape the coming century. For Japan, the Versailles decision seemed like a diplomatic victory. But it came at a high cost. Where once it had portrayed itself as a protector of Asia, Versailles revealed Japan as just another imperialist power, seizing land and exploiting China's weakness. The goodwill that had existed after Japan's defeat of Russia in 1905 was now gone. China-Japan relations entered a new era of deep suspicion and hostility. The May 4th movement ignited decades of anti-Japanese sentiment and cast Japan as an occupier, not an ally. This resentment would explode into armed conflict in the 1930s. Even within Japan, the Versailles outcome was bittersweet. Though the nation gained Shandong and Pacific mandates, it had also experienced a bruising diplomatic rejection. Its racial equality proposal was discarded, and its role at the peace table was minimized by the Western powers. Japan had won the war. But Versailles made clear, it was still not welcomed into the club of Western empires, not fully, not equally. It had secured new territory, but lost moral standing. It had grown stronger, but more isolated. And the seeds of future conflict, both with the West and with China, had been sown. With the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, Japan emerged with tangible rewards and intangible frustrations. On paper, it had solidified its status as a victor of the Great War. It gained Shandong Province, a foothold on the Chinese mainland, and a League of Nations mandate over Germany's former colonies in the Pacific north of the equator, the Mariana, Caroline, and Marshall Islands. These islands, scattered across the central and western Pacific, were rebranded under the Japanese-administered South Seas Mandate. Though technically under international oversight, the League's supervision was lax. Japan wasted no time treating these territories as its own, establishing garrisons, building infrastructure, and extending its influence across a vast oceanic expanse. Strategically, the islands were invaluable. They formed a defensive barrier, stretching from the coast of East Asia nearly to Micronesia. In time, airstrips and naval outposts would be constructed, not openly militarized during the 1920s, but carefully positioned. The seeds of future wartime logistics were being quietly planted in these distant tropical atolls. At home, Japan's expanding empire was a source of pride, but also a catalyst for growing militarism. World War I had accelerated Japan's industrial growth, as factories churned out textiles, ships, and war material. But now, in the post-war world, the booming economy faced new challenges: inflation, labor unrest, and the return of demobilized soldiers seeking purpose and employment. Political parties struggled to maintain control, and the military, especially the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, began asserting greater independence. Officers believed that Japan's security and honor depended not on parliamentary debate, but on strength and readiness. The humiliating rejection of Japan's racial equality proposal at Versailles, along with the Western powers' reluctance to treat Japan as a true equal, reinforced the belief that Japan needed to chart its own path, one that might not align with Western ideals. This thinking gained ground during the 1920s, even as Japan remained outwardly committed to international diplomacy. The country participated in disarmament conferences, including the Washington Naval Conference of 1921 to 1922, where Japan agreed to limit its battleship tonnage to maintain peace. But resentment brewed beneath the surface. The fact that Japan was forced to accept a 5-to-5-to-3 naval ratio, meaning its fleet could be only 60% the size of those of the US and Britain, was seen as another symbol of racial and strategic inequality. It sowed distrust and fed the argument among nationalists that Japan would never be allowed to grow peacefully within the existing world order. Meanwhile, in China, Japan's control of Shandong became a lightning rod. Chinese resentment simmered long after the Treaty of Versailles. Anti-Japanese boycotts erupted, and Chinese students studied the occupation as proof of foreign betrayal. While Japan eventually returned Shandong's sovereignty to China in 1922, it retained economic rights, ensuring its influence remained, but the damage to its reputation was irreversible. In the Pacific, the South Seas Mandate evolved into an extension of Japanese identity. Japanese settlers, teachers, and businessmen moved to the islands. Schools were built, roads were paved, and ports were expanded, not just for trade, but for quiet, long-term military potential. To outsiders, Japan appeared committed to peace. To those watching closely, it was building a foundation for future power projection. The Great War had offered Japan legitimacy. Versailles had offered territory. But neither had offered respect or equality. In response, Japan increasingly turned inward, confident in its destiny, wary of its allies, and shaped by a worldview that saw future conflict as not just possible, but perhaps inevitable. The final act of the First World War had closed. But for Japan, the stage was already being prepared for the next. By the early 1920s, Japan stood at a crossroads. It had emerged from World War I on the winning side, its flag flying over Qingdao, Shandong, and a growing constellation of islands in the Pacific. Its economy had surged, its navy had patrolled distant seas, and its diplomats had sat, if uneasily, among the great powers at Versailles. But beneath the surface of triumph, deep fault lines were forming. Though Japan had fought as an ally, the post-war world had not truly welcomed it. The rejection of the racial equality proposal, the imposed naval limitations, and the growing suspicion from Western nations all sent a clear message: Japan might be powerful, but it was not trusted, not fully accepted, not treated as an equal. This contradiction would shape Japan's direction for the decades to come. In Tokyo, political parties still debated, and democracy appeared to take root. But the rising tide of nationalism, militarism, and imperial pride was growing louder. The idea of a Japan constrained by Western rules, forced to accept inequality, became harder to justify to its people, its soldiers, and its leaders. And while the rest of the world celebrated peace, Japan looked at its new empire and began to prepare for the next phase of its rise. The League of Nations mandate over the Pacific Islands gave Japan a foothold thousands of kilometers from its home islands, key stepping stones towards Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Western Pacific. These islands would later become launchpads for Japan's offensives in World War II, but even in the 1920s, military planners saw their value. In China, too, Japan's presence remained a source of tension. Though it returned Shandong to Chinese sovereignty in 1922, it retained powerful economic and strategic interests, especially in Manchuria, where Japan controlled the South Manchurian Railway and guarded it with military forces. Over time, these interests would justify deeper interventions, culminating in the invasion of Manchuria in 1931. The ideals of Versailles, peace, self-determination, equality, had failed to resonate where they mattered most. For many in Japan, the post-war order had proven that diplomacy could only go so far. If Japan wanted security and respect, it might need to take it by force. That belief would define the next generation of leaders. Yet World War I also left behind quieter legacies: a more literate and urbanized population, a flowering of new art and literature, and a brief experiment with parliamentary politics. For a time, Japan seemed poised to follow the path of Britain or France, a constitutional monarchy with global influence. But the scars of Versailles ran deep. They were more than diplomatic snubs. They were psychological wounds, interpreted as proof that the West would always draw the line at race, at culture, at true partnership. And so, in the years to follow, Japan would move further down a path of self-reliance, strategic expansion, and ultimately, militarized empire. The story of Japan in World War I is often forgotten. Overshadowed by the catastrophes of the next war, it appears, at first, to be a side note. But in truth, it was the prologue. A story of a nation that arrived at the world stage with ambition, loyalty, and vision, only to be reminded that power is not always met with acceptance. And in that space between honor and humiliation, between alliance and alienation, Japan's empire hardened. The rising sun, once a symbol of modernization and reform, would return in the 1930s not as a participant, but as a challenger to the very order it had once tried to join. From Qingdao to Versailles, the path was laid. The echoes of World War I would ring again, louder, darker, and deadlier, in the decades that followed.